He is credited rightly with inventing much of what we think of as modern film technique. But Griffith himself credited one man with teaching him everything he knew about film. The man he credited was Charles Dickens. And of course, Dickens died several decades before film was invented. But what Griffith learned from him, and it was just about everything, about this new art form of the 20th century, goes straight to the heart of the experience of literature, the experience of it as we read. And that's what I want to speak to you about today. Pause for a moment and consider what goes on within you when you read a wonderful world, book of fiction. The characters and the settings are evoked in your mind as images and sounds. As we read, we watch and we listen to Frank Chambers and Cora Papadakis, Tom Shaw and Jean Reed, Sam Spade and Bridget O'Shaughnessy. The experience is, in a very real way, a cinema of the mind, of the inner consciousness. The creators of fiction are the writers and directors and editors of the cinema. And the techniques they employ have direct counterparts in modern film technique. When I arrived at this insight as an aspiring writer some 4 decades ago, I finally, and because of it, found my voice and my vision and my craft. And as a reader, I have drawn far greater pleasure and richer insight from my reading when I've been able to stop all my analytical, self-conscious, extra-textual thinking as I read and simply let go to the experience of the inner movie. So what I'd like to do this morning is to look at a couple of texts with you to explore this deep connection of film and fiction. But first, let's just briefly articulate some of those film concepts that writers most frequently employ. Now, some of these will be familiar to you, but let me just name them and get them in your head. The shot is, of course, the basic building block of movies. From the point of view of the spectator, the shot is the smallest unit of visual experience, a finite, uninterrupted flow of imagery. From the moment the image begins to the moment when it ends, that's the shot. And it is the basic building block of every film. Then there are a number of transitional devices, of course, for getting from one shot to another, including some exotic ones, the fades and dissolves and wipes and the crosscuts. I won't seek examples this morning of those rarer devices in this limited time we have, but I assure you that they have literary equivalents. One of the great scenes of cross-cutting is in Madame Bovary, Flaubert, for example. By far the most common device, however, for getting from one shot to another is the cut. You see an image on the screen, a snap, it's not there, another image is there. And the term cut goes back to the old days of movies, back before 1995, when they were actually produced on film stock, and to get from one shot to another, the editor would actually cut the film and splice it into the next shot. However, these concepts can also be seen as descriptive of the basic flow, not only of the film, but of the narrative voice as picture maker. These pictures in our minds have a life in time. They begin to develop to end, and they transition one from the other and to the other in the equivalence of filmic concepts. Furthermore, the narrative voice in fiction is always adjusting our view of the physical world that it creates, which is equivalent to another group of film techniques on a continuum from extreme long shot to medium straight to shot to close up to extreme close up. The narrative voice is always placing our reader's consciousness at a certain distance from the images that it's creating. It can place us at a far distance or bring us into a position of intimate proximity by the choice of details which it allows us to actually visualize as we read. Now, not only do fiction and film adjust us in terms of our physical relationship to the image, but they also are constantly adjusting our sense of the passage of time. Fiction and film both have real time as their primary speed, but they often slow time down or speed it up, operating in slow motion, fast motion. We all instantly have examples of slow motion easily in our from our movie going. Examples that would cover a wide gamut of emotions, from the lovers running in slow motion toward each other on a train platform to violence. I think of the director Sam Peckinpah, who in the late 1960s basically invented cinematic slow motion. Remember the Wild Bunch? And those our heroes were the bad guys there, and they all get blown away in excruciating slow motion at the end of the movie. Mm-hmm. So, in fiction, however, then of course there's fast motion. Fiction, we can use slow motion with a variety of emotional valences, but fast motion is pretty much another thing, because it almost always has a comic effect. That wonderfully dark early vampire movie, Nosferatu, for example. There's a scene in which the Count's arriving in a ship, and they take his coffin off the ship and they put it in a cart, and it's all done in fast motion, and it's just inevitably comic. In fiction, however, fast motion can be used in a variety of emotional circumstances. Now, the last film technique I want to remind you about is perhaps one of the most crucial, because it's absolutely essential to film. And I've been teaching creative writing in graduate programs for 29 years, and my students, they don't understand how you put that this concept works in fiction. And the concept I'm talking about is montage. Now, this was a term that the great Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein used in terms of film. Simply put, montage creates meaning by placing two things next to each other. It's the juxtaposition of elements that create a third thing, a meaning. In a work of fiction, everything is laden with potential affect, as in a movie. And whenever you put two of anything next to each other, a third thing emerges inevitably, and that's what montage is about. If you see an image, crude example on a movie screen of a freshly dug and refilled grave on a slope, and then we cut to a woman in black walking slowly down a gravel path beneath some trees, inevitably you just understand that woman has just left a loved one in that grave, okay? And it's that inevitability also attends to fiction. In film, the juxtaposed elements are most often visual, but in fiction, the flexibility is pretty wide. And the montage is always happening in fiction as it is in film. But this is not just a concept of art. This is a concept of human perception. So let's look at two passages now from fiction in light of all this. Appropriately, I'll turn first to the man who taught D.W. Griffith everything he knew about film, Charles Dickens. Incidentally, and it's going to be about Great Expectations, perhaps his masterpiece. And I've always thought that a great noir novel could be written out of Great Expectations by just flipping the point of view into the point of view of Magwitch, the criminal. Abel Magwitch has a black soul, and he gets it in his head for complex reasons to do some good by playing benefactor to this little boy who's happened to help him when he was a convict on the run. But his motives are corrupted by his own darkness and his deep self-interest, and in trying to help the boy, he ends up committing murder and ultimately manipulates the boy above his station into a life of frustrated, lost aspirations, and which is pretty much what Otto talks about in terms of what the essence, the purest noir is. So this passage is near the opening of Great Expectations. Our narrator, Philip Pirrip, is writing in his adulthood looking back to his childhood as an orphan, and he refers to himself sometimes in the third person and sometimes in the first. During his childhood, he's called Pip. The people mentioned here at first are his dead siblings and his parents, his dead parents. And the guy about to make an entrance is Magwitch. So listen to the movie. Ours was the marsh country down by the river, within as the river wound 20 miles of the sea. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time I found out for certain that this place, bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of the parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no habit, with broken shoes, with an old rag tied round his head, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lamed by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir, please," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." All right. Dickens begins with an image that they call, of course, in movies, the establishing shot. We're at a memorable raw afternoon toward evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with gates with scattered cattle feeding on it was the marshes. He lifts the camera from the dead brother and looks off to a long shot out to the wilderness beyond the churchyard. And then where? And that the low leaden line beyond was the river. This is an even longer shot. And then he takes us even farther out, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea. He takes us to an extreme long shot to the farthest horizon. Then what? He cuts from that distant horizon to a close-up of the orphan child, the narrator of our novel. The small bundle of shivers, afraid of growing of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip. To understand filmic montage and literary montage, let's consider a logical alternative way to write this. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of the parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. Perfectly logical, perfectly thoughtful, and totally filmic. Dead father, dead mother, dead brother, dead brother, dead brother, dead brother, dead brother, the last remaining child in the family. Montage, of course, but in such a novel as that, where you went from the last dead brother to the remaining child, you would be in a totally different world from the one that Dickens was creating. You would be in a world where the focus is on the plight of an orphan, a family in trouble, a sociological problem, a sentimental tale of a struggling child. Dickens' novel is about something far greater. It has the broad, dark, pervasive worldview of noir. When you move from that last dead child to the marshes and the river and to the far horizon, and the whole sensual world is bleak and empty and mysterious, and there's a dark wind blowing from that far horizon, and then you cut to the child. That montage creates something utterly different, a world that holds within it the challenges Pip will face, the forces that are moments later to come into his life to secretly manipulate him, the innate bleakness of existence, the darkness at the heart of the things, the savage wind of human destiny. Let's go farther into the passage. "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice as a man started up among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." How does Pip respond to this? "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir." How long do you think it took him to come to that response? A nanosecond. And how is it written? I'd ask you to listen carefully because there's something really interesting buried in this passage. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat. A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a grain iron on his leg," period. "A man with no hat and with broken shoes and with an old rag tied round his head," period. "A man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lain by stones and cut by flints and stung by nettles and torn by briars. Who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. Oh, don't cut my throat." This is extreme slow motion, because all of that comes between "I'm going to cut your throat" and "oh, don't." What is the psychological reality of that? When was the last time you skidded your car on a wet pavement? Everything slows down. That telephone pole is floating in your direction in extreme slow motion. And we have seen this many times in movies. The devices of literature and the devices of movies are both used as an accurate portrayal of the human psyche with these innate film techniques. What's unusual about those 3 sentences in that paragraph where time has stopped? I tried to point it up in that second reading of it. Not one of those 3 apparent sentences is an actual complete sentence. There's not a single independent verb in any of them. Why? Time has slowed so much as to have essentially stopped. And what are the parts of speech that signify a passage of time? Active verbs. Things happen in time, in our language, in the verbs. But there's nothing happening in this slow to stopped passage in this film novel, except perception. The extreme slow motion of fear. It is beautifully appropriate, and you don't even notice that there are no verbs there, except if in an after-the-fact analytical way. Otto might know, but he's a good editor. And then he would say, "Oh man, that works." It's good filmmaking. It's good cinematic writing, even down to the syntax. Now let's turn to an example that will be familiar to all of you. This is from Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. A telephone bell rang in darkness. When it had rung 3 times, bed springs creaked, fingers fumbled on wood. Something small and hard thudded on a carpeted floor. The springs creaked again, and a man's voice said, "Hello? Yes, speaking. Dead? Yes. 15 minutes. Thanks." A switch clicked, and a white bowl hung on 3 gilded chains from the ceiling center filled the room with light. Spade, barefooted in green and white checked pajamas, sat on the side of his bed. He scowled at the telephone on the table while his hands took from beside it a packet of brown papers and a sack of Bull Durham tobacco. Cold, steamy air blew in through 2 open windows, bringing with it 6 times a minute the Alcatraz foghorn's dull moaning. A tinny alarm clock, insecurely mounted on a corner of Duke's Celebrated Criminal Cases of America, face down on the table, held its hands at 5 minutes past 2. Spade's thick fingers made a cigarette with deliberate care, sifting a measured quantity of tan flakes down into curved paper, spreading the flakes so that they lay equal at the ends with a slight depression in the middle, thumbs rolling the paper's inner edge down and up under the outer edge as forefingers pressed it over, thumbs and fingers sliding to the paper cylinder's ends to hold it even while tongue licked the flap, left forefinger and thumb pinching their end, while right forefinger and thumb smoothed the damp seam, right forefinger and thumb twisting their end and lifting the other to Spade's mouth. He picked up the pigskin and nickel lighter that had fallen to the floor, manipulated it, and with the cigarette burning in the corner of his mouth, stood up. He took off his pajamas. The smooth thickness of his arms, legs, and body, the sag of his big rounded shoulders made his body like a bear's. It was like a shaved bear's. His chest was hairless. His skin was childishly soft and pink. He scratched the back of his neck and began to dress. He put on a thin white union suit, gray socks, black garters, and dark brown shoes. When he fastened his shoes, he picked up the telephone, called Greystone 4500, and ordered a taxicab. All right, let's look at how Hammett directs and edits this scene. This is the beginning of the second chapter. It's important to note what this phone call is all about. And also note that Spade received the news, and we watch him dress and go out without our ever expressly learning what it's about in that scene. Spade's partner, Miles Archer, has been murdered while shadowing a man for a mysterious female client they had met that morning. And what do we see on the movie screen in our mind as this phone call comes in? Only darkness. A telephone bell rang in darkness. When it had rung 3 times, bed springs creaked, fingers fumbled on wood, something small and hard thudded on the carpeted floor. The springs creaked again, and a man's voice said, "Hello? Yes, speaking, dead, yes, 15 minutes, thanks." This is the perfect cinematic rendering of the deepening of a mystery. The telephone bell that comes out of the blackness, the fumbling in the dark. And the voice is familiar to us in that we half assume it's Spade, from the montage of his being the last person we saw at the end of the previous chapter. But cinematically, we don't have confirmation of this because Hammett withholds any dialogue tag from the answering voice, simply identifying it as a man. So the screen remains black in our heads. And in this context, then, the word dead emerges from the darkness with a powerful extra force. Then Hammett gives this. A switch clicked and a white bowl hung on 3 gilded chains from the ceiling center filled the room with light. We have one more sound from the darkness, and then we are looking at a light fixture, and it is in close-up with white bowl and gilded chains. The montage of this, we have darkness and then light, but the effect is ironic. We see closely, but we see nothing yet to reveal the circumstances. We have light, but no illumination. A mystery. Then Hammett cuts to our man in a medium shot. Spade, barefooted in green and white check pajamas, sat on the side of the bed. He scowled at the telephone on the table while his hands took from beside it a packet of brown papers and a sack of Bull Durham tobacco. The phone is down. Someone is dead. But Spade's emotion is a scowl. Not only a scowl, but a scowl that is undercut even in that by the simultaneous thinking of the cigarette. And his response then is to pull the tobacco out and roll that cigarette. Again, as movies and fiction both manipulate our instincts to put adjacent things together, we are expecting this death to have something to do with the case underway. Since Spade did not know the caller, he said, "Yes, speaking." This wasn't Archer on the phone. So part of us begins to think that the dead man could be Spade's partner. And yet, that montage tease is effective because, from what we saw in the previous chapter, there was an ease of nonverbal communication, an implicit camaraderie between the 2 men, and he is his partner. So Spade's emotional attitude after the phone call is a surprise. Now we see Spade begin to roll his cigarette. with Alcatraz's foghorn blowing. And Hammett directs this with such repetitive detail that we experience it in slow motion. Spade's thick fingers made a cigarette with deliberate care. The technique yields a very subtle literary effect, as in the Dickens passage. Slow motion here suggests a strong feeling, especially given that there's been a death just on it that he's heard about, and yet, given the commonplace nature of the action, it also suggests the opposite. The image is in extreme close-up on the manipulation of the tobacco and paper. This suggests Spade's absorption is primarily on this everyday task. There are no thoughts or feelings expressed. This is cinema, and the ambiguity is the point. This turn of events does indeed have a considerable effect on Spade. His feelings are strong, but they are not the ones you might expect. Once we learn a page or so later that Miles Archer is indeed the dead man, we fully understand the complexity of Spade's reaction in this scene. You can't find a simple abstraction to label it. Not grief, not anger, not vengefulness, none of the easy ones. Especially not after what we find out in the next chapter, that Spade has been sleeping with Archer's wife. After the cigarette is rolled in slow motion, Hammett speeds up the action, though we are still trapped in the quotidian with Spade. He picked up the pigskin and nickel lighter that had fallen to the floor, manipulated it, and with the cigarette burning in a corner of his mouth, stood up. He took off his pajamas. How does the action speed up? After the meticulous detail of thumbs and forefingers in paper, he simply manipulated the lighter and took off his pajamas. And then we see Spade in a surprising way. We slow down again a little for this. The smooth thickness of his arms, legs, and body, the sag of his big round shoulders, made his body like a bear's. It was like a shaved bear's. His chest was hairless. His skin was childishly soft and pink. In this vividly cinematic image of his nakedness, we experience his physical vulnerability. But the physicalness of the vulnerability is given a great visual image to create a splendid, ironic, undercutting, cinematic montage. He scratched the back of his neck and began to dress. That casual, routine, waking up in the middle of the night scratch on the neck, in this context, speaks to an inner life